It's great to see you all here to look at this very interesting topic. What makes for a good life? What is likely to lead us to a satisfying life or a happy life? Happiness is a topic that Australians seem very interested in, especially in the last 10 years or so. It's got a lot of attention. There was an article in the Herald yesterday, in fact, about happiness, and it seems to be that there's always articles also talking about depression and anxiety, and I might talk about some of that today as well, but let's jump in straight away and I'll introduce our panel. Ross Gittins is to my left. Ross has been the economics editor of the Sydney Morning Herald for over 30 years, and he doesn't look like slowing down anytime soon. Great to have you here, Ross. Ross has been an author, of course. Gittinomics is one of his books, The Happy Economist, and his latest is Gittins Gospel. Beside Ross is Thubten Chokyi, who is a Buddhist nun and international director of the Liberation Prison Project. She is the spiritual program coordinator and a teacher at the Vajrayana Institute in Sydney, which has a lot to do with the Happiness Conference, which has been put on for the last several years in Sydney and now in Melbourne. And beside Chokyi is Mark McCrindle. Mark is the director of McCrindle Research. He has an international reputation for discovering and tracking social trends, and he's going to talk to us about how he observes Australians and their attitude towards our important topic. So I'm going to start with you, Mark, and ask you, from your observations, are Australians happy?
Well, we must be happy because the OECD study tells us we are. It tells us we're the most happy people.
I might pick up on that as we go, yeah.
Yeah, and that's a study that measures well-being across a number of different areas, and we've been moving up the ranks there. It made me happy reading the report that we beat Sweden and Denmark, because for an OECD study to have us ahead of them is a rare thing. So that was good. But I think we are happy generally. Our research, this is one of the barometer areas that we look at in the Australian community. How happy are you? Life satisfaction, this sort of thing. And 9 in 10 Australians say that to some extent they're happy. And so that's pretty good going. It's declined a little bit in the last 5 years, our studies of this. So there's a sense that we're not as happy as we were. Maybe the downturn, GFC, has had a bit of an impact on that. But when we ask people why they're happy and why are we a happy nation, it essentially comes down to 3 things. The first is our culture and lifestyle. And so we're pretty relaxed, down-to-earth, no-worries sort of culture. People love that, love the life here. The second is the climate and the landscape. People love the living in this place, middle of winter, and here we are, a bit of sun. It's fantastic. And then the third area is our community and our interactions, and we're pretty much a peaceable, diverse culture, and people connect well in that. So that's, I think, what defines our happiness, and people say, yeah, we are happy.
Chokyi, happiness sometimes to me sounds a bit too frivolous a term. But what do you mean when you talk about happiness?
Well, when I'm talking about happiness, I guess I'm thinking about something that's a bit enduring beyond the economic highs and lows that the OECD might measure. Actually, it was quite interesting in that study because it's of developed countries. So it doesn't include countries like Bhutan, which has measures gross national happiness. It's part of their sort of governance. If you can legislate for happiness, probably not. But at least, having that inclusive of a sense of social well-being. And I think we're social beings as human beings, so that's very important. But this sort of deeper sense of inner contentment that regardless of the weather, gorgeous day today, and then it'll get rainy at some point and maybe not so gorgeous or whatever, regardless of all these changes, the highs and lows and the hard times, the good times, that this sort of sense of inner contentment, a serenity, a peace, that we can deal with all situations with a mind of equanimity.
Now, Ross, the survey that was mentioned, I know you've got some questions about the survey itself, but putting that aside, it's measuring things like jobs, employment, income and health. Are they the right measure of the good life?
Employment, income and health are important measures of well-being, particularly material well-being. But when you start talking about the good life, then there are that really brings in a lot of social, even spiritual aspects of our lives, over and above the kind of material basics. And to me, they're the things that are more important, because they're the things that we are in greater danger of getting wrong or actually kind of eating into, while we're busy making sure that everybody's got a job, everybody's got decent housing, and we've got a reasonable health system.
Now, you're an economist, so does this make you, if you're thinking about these things beyond those measures, does that make you unique or a bit standing out?
Doesn't make me unique, it just makes me a weirdo. I had someone who was the son of a famous Australian economist taking me to task about it all last night.
Okay.
Who hadn't quite got on to what I was on about,
now,
which is not to just bang out the same message as all the economists.
Yeah, the Fairfax has introduced a measure, hasn't it, that goes beyond just economics?
Yeah, but it is a measure. One of the issues here, and the issues from a government or governance point of view, is that a lot of the harder things to measure, we don't measure. I mean, enormous proportion of the effort of the Bureau of Statistics just goes into measuring all the things that need to be measured to get a reasonably accurate measure of gross domestic product. That means that there are all these other things that are important to life that don't get regularly measured, don't get measured well. They're often very hard to measure. And I have very mixed feelings about the importance of measurement. But one of the things I do believe is that if you don't measure things, it's much more likely that those things will be ignored. And because we put so much effort and taxpayers' money into measuring the growth in our production of goods and services, GDP, it's just a human tendency to focus on that magic number and to take it more seriously than we should. And that's kind of as I've got older and hopefully more sensible as an economic commentator, that's one of the things that I try to keep saying. And part of that was the Herald paying some economists to go away and give us at least a broader measure of what can be measured.
Now, Mark, is happiness the sort of thing that if you pursue it, it's likely to be elusive? It's more of a byproduct. We sometimes hear people talk in those terms.
Yeah, I think so. In the US Constitution, famously, it's got the words, the pursuit of happiness. And maybe it's more of an American thing that you go after and anyone can, and it's the land of opportunity. In Australia, we're a bit more relaxed. That sounds like a lot of hard work. It's the land of the long weekend, after all. And we're into happiness. The first line in our national anthem, Australians all let us rejoice. We're young and free. And I guess our happiness, at least from a popular perspective, comes because of not what we pursue, but just what we have. You know, the climate, the culture, the freedoms, the opportunity. You know, here in this country, we were running research in this area asking Australians what they thought. And some of the negatives of the past, like the tyranny of distance, now we see as positive, you know, that we're close to the new epicentre of power in terms of Asia, and some distance is a good thing. And one of the respondents in the survey wrote, we're living in the granny flat of the world, throwing one heck of a party, you know. And I think that's the Aussie attitude, you know. So it's not so much a pursuit of happiness, it's this, we're the lucky country, you know. We just are happy because of the external things that we get, which is great, except that, as Chokyi was saying, it's a bit sort of temporal. What if the weather changes? What if you don't just get the good things? And if our happiness is totally dependent on the situational, on the temporal situation of things, on more superficial issues, then I think by the nature of the cycles of life and realities of the downs and the ups, we're going to have significant times when we're not happy.
Well, Chokyi, you guys are focusing on happiness in the conference over a number of years. I once heard Hugh Mackay open his speech at the happiness conference by saying, I want to talk about sadness. His point was that happiness is in a way meaningless unless it's set against the other inevitable emotions of life. Yeah. How did that resonate with you?
Oh, totally. I think we probably wouldn't be here talking about happiness if we didn't know the downside. And I would say unhappiness rather than sadness, because I think that's a completely different emotion, and it's not necessarily a negative emotion. It's a stuff of life. Stuff happens. But it's that sense of happiness that comes through resilience of dealing with the difficulties of life, the problems of life, and coming out humbler, happier as a result of that. Process. So it's really because we have empathy. We know about when we have difficulties and problems and suffering and pain, and just on a physical level, let alone emotional and all sort of other sort of sufferings. That we can empathise with others and we can show kindness. And I think that's one of the greatest sources of happiness, of being kind to others. One act of kindness. And we feel good. Hopefully the other person also feels good, or the other people also feel good. But we can see that generates out happiness beyond ourselves.
Now, Ross, I want to ask you about, you've thought a lot about this. Dan Gilbert, who's a professor at Harvard, wrote, and I can't remember exactly, but it was something like 90% of our happiness is bought with the first 10% of our wealth. Does that picture fit roughly with your observations?
It certainly fits with the evidence that's been collected by the psychologists who study happiness. And the study of happiness is a big new area of psychology in the past 20 or 30 years. There have been some economists who've challenged that because economists would much prefer to believe that there was a clear link between happiness, well-being and growth in your income, because that's what economists know how to do, help you grow your income, help the community grow their income. And they spend all of their time figuring out how that works and how you do it. And that's what economists sell. And they don't like to hear this story from the psychologists, which says once you reach a fairly low level of material well-being, adding more gets less and less effective in terms of making you feel better about your life. But I think there is a lot of evidence towards that. You can demonstrate that in a country like Australia, the people with the highest incomes feel happier than the people with the middle incomes and the lower incomes. But when you look at that, really that's mainly about status. It's about saying, since I've got more money than all of these guys, I've got more status than them, and I quite like that. Well, that's actually not about true well-being or it's certainly not about the good life. And it's also nothing that the economists can help you with. Because if we get satisfaction out of being well up in the pecking order, the economists can't move us all to the front of the queue.
So there are things beyond the measurable that will contribute to the good life or our well-being. Could it be, Mark, that in the sense that in as much as anxiety and depression are growing in this country, and we read from Beyond Blue that 1 in 8 men, 1 in 5 women will experience depression, and it's higher for anxiety. Could it be that there's a link there between the spiritual question, the God question, in terms of us sort of shrugging that off and going it alone? Do you imagine there might be a connection there? And I'll ask you that as well, Chokyi.
I think there is. I mean,
I hope you're going to ask me
I'll
too.
ask you. Feel free
Ross
to
has got
jump
an
answer
opinion
that,
as
Ross.
well.
Yeah.
We're ticking all the boxes, aren't we? We're the wealthiest that we've ever been in the history of civilization, and this next generation, the most materially endowed generation in history, and we're the most technologically supplied generation ever. And here we are with 25 years longer life expectancy than our predecessors had in Australia 100 years ago. We've added 3 months of life every 12 months of existence for the last century in Australia, straight from the ABS data. So we're living longer, wealthier, technology, opportunities, we can travel, we've got it all, tick, tick, tick. And yet, exactly as you said, Simon, the mental health, the satisfaction, the uncertainties are growing. Our happiness, in a sense, is not, the fulfilment is not there. So it does say that there's probably something, a box, that's not as well ticked. And I think that, ultimately we do look for deeper needs. Probably the best known passage of scripture in both Judaism and Christianity is Psalm 23, which talks about the human experience as being like a sheep in need of a shepherd. And so it's the need for the external, not just what I can attain and do. And it talks about the reality that we all experience, that you walk through a valley of a shadow of death and yet you fear no evil. That's what we want, to fear no ill even in the tough times. It talks about just needing soul being restored because we all feel dry and used up. It talks about the table of enemies there because we all have the enemies and the detractors. And yet it concludes by saying, with the good shepherd, your cup runneth over, And that, I think, is happiness. In the valley of death, in the tough times, amidst the enemies, we can still have this overflowing fulfillment, and I think that's what people want. Now, how they get that is the big issue, but I think that's the box that they want ticked, and it's not just through the economics of life. Okay,
thank you. Chokyi?
Well, it's interesting with our happiness conference because it's true, as Mark said, that we're living longer and healthier and so forth. And actually, Ed Diener, who is an expert on social well-being and happiness in the States, spoke about people who are happier tend to get married younger, stay married happily. They tend to volunteer, which is great news for us because we get happier volunteers and more people volunteering, live longer, and have better health. So it's sort of good for a nation, really. On the flip side of that is the fact that, when I'm working with the prisoners in the prison project, I'm working with the unhappiest people, the really broken people. I mean, people who come to us are people who've realised what they've done's got them where they are, and they want to turn their lives around. They want to do something different. They say, you've got to help me not go back to the gangs. You've got to help me deal with this crazy mind, because really their unhappiness, their depression and so forth is a product of what's going on in their minds. I mean, all of us, we have these sort of monkey minds, crazy minds. And being able to control that through meditation and so forth. I mean, what's a beauty, coming back to the measures, is that now those things are being measured. For 2,500 years we've been saying it works, it works, it works. And now it's being measured, over the past 20, 30 years, measuring the brain responses. And actually now in terms of, and seeing that through meditation, people not only become calmer, less, in a prison context, less violent, less angry, become able to self-regulate, develop pro-social behaviour, but also developing more compassion. And so now actually they're starting to do studies on compassion, and it's meditation on compassion, engaging in compassionate acts has a far more profound effect on the level of happiness than when they were studying mindfulness meditation, for example.
Okay, and Ross, can you be just a quick one on that one?
Well, one of the things the psychologists have demonstrated is that although our material standard of living in all Western countries keeps getting better and better, almost as every year passes, we haven't, on all the long-established measures of happiness or well-being, we haven't been getting any happier. I don't find it hard to believe a thesis that says maybe part of that explanation is that in this process we've all become a lot, as a community, we become less religious, less committed to the kind of church-going and beliefs that we used to have. I don't find that hard to believe, and I don't find it because I think that a big part of deep satisfaction is and a deep need in all humans is to have meaning and purpose in their lives. For historically, much of the meaning and purpose we've got has come to us through our religious beliefs. And if we just say, oh, well, we're not interested in that stuff anymore, then I don't find it hard to believe that more of us are feeling anxious, depressed, even committing suicide. Not all of us, of course, but more of us.
Okay, thank you. Now I want to bring in a question or two from the audience. And Chokyi, you were talking about compassion. There's a question here that asks, how do we translate, or what helps to translate the emotion of empathy into compassion? And there is a question following that which is not unrelated, which is to do with asylum seekers and happiness. So perhaps, Chokyi, if you wouldn't mind just mentioning what you think on that, and then Mark, you might have a go.
Well, the thing about compassion is we don't have to translate anything into compassion because we are innately compassionate. If we actually look at evolution of species and see that, turtles look after their young, the mother will look after the young until they're born, and then they've got to make their own way to the ocean, and maybe they live and maybe they don't. But if you look through evolution up to the human, you can see that, Darwin observed this, that we have this innate compassion. Look at a mother will look after a child, but if we extend that out to people even we don't know, we demonstrate compassion in times of crisis and emergency to people we don't know, when there's a fire, a flood, an avalanche and so forth. So we seem to have a natural tendency to want to engage in compassionate acts. And it's like, it's more to the point of what gets in the way of that, whether it's our fear, our anxiety, our sense of helplessness, or our sense of, I haven't really got time for that, I've got work to do, families to feed, so forth. So really, it's really, if we look at what's natural to us, we will be propelled towards compassion.
Thank you. Mark, I might direct another question so we can get through a few more of these. The question here says, if religion makes us happy and are the religions equal in that ability? Well, certainly religion can make us unhappy. I think that's been shown to be the case. When you think about Christian faith, which calls you to sort of counterintuitively lay down your life in order to pick it up, is that part of something that resonates for you in terms of achieving the fulfilling, satisfied, happy life?
Yeah, I think so, because it is about giving and serving, and it is about not just some religious mindset or religious ritual, but it is about an active, life-changing faith. I think that's the only sort of faith that makes a difference. Even with the census results, 61% of Australians still identify as their religion Christianity. Actually, Buddhism is the number 2 religion in Australia, about 2.5%, and in Islam after that, and then the other religions. But firstly, on Christianity, it's been dropping off slightly over the years, 4% in the 5 years between the 2 census of late, and yet what really has dropped off is the actual activity and practice of Christianity. So people have some vague identity with Christianity, but of the people who tick the box, only about 1 in 10 actually will attend church and probably are active in personally practicing their faith, in terms of it not just being some ritual or some identity, but actually a relationship and life-changing. And so I think these issues of compassion, I think these issues of laying down your life and serving, of having a heart for others, of living in community, of giving and making a contribution, are part of what true Christianity and the full gospel really is all about. And I think the more that we make religion just an identity, the more that we just make it a tick the box on a form rather than active in it, I think we end up diluting it down to sort of a meaninglessness, and society will say, well, actually, I've got a corporate giving program and I'll give there, and I volunteer at the local school up the road, and I meet community by joining this club, and what do I need the church for? You guys just deal with sort of religion and spirituality. And no wonder the fastest growing of all of these worldviews is actually the no religion or none of those religions box, which now has 3 in 10 Australians ticking that, because I think their experience has been a bit of emptiness in the other ones.
So if that's true, Ross, and you're often talking about things like community, relationships and so on, and other person-centeredness to find the answer to this question, what's the likelihood of, without that sort of grounding, that we'll be able to truly live in that fashion? Because it seems like we hear that and we think, yeah, I get it, but it's very, very hard to develop even with that faith commitment.
Yeah, well, I think that without strong religious belief in any country, it is harder to organise a community, a society in a way that's more harmonious, where we worry as much as we should about the well-being of other people. I don't doubt that that's true.
But if you don't have that belief, of course it's true that wisdom for life, and this is what we're talking about here, wisdom for life seems to be, Hugh Mackay's latest book tells us this. He has a great line at the end of the book that says, no one can guarantee you that a life lived for others will lead to satisfaction, but it's sure that nothing else will. Seems like that's a hard lesson to learn, Chokyi.
Well, it is a very hard lesson to learn.
Yeah.
Actually, I think the guarantees are there. I think all the evidence of, what really makes us happy is leading a meaningful life, is leading a life of virtue that's dedicated to others. This sort of genuine happiness, which Aristotle called eudaimonia, this sort of human good, a life of virtue, or Augustine called the truth-given joy. As Buddhists, we say, well, that joy is true to us innately. So it's there with us. And that joy comes from benefiting others. I mean, we see that in evidence in our lives. And whether it's measured statistically or not, we know the effects of that. And, there is that thing of, there are feel-good people, aren't there? They're nice to be around. We gravitate towards people because they're exuding that sense of well-being and positivity and so forth. That's sort of like our natural drive is towards that.
Can I ask you a question? Because I want to draw a distinction here in the way of your thinking and perhaps some other ways of thinking. So in the West, happiness is linked to feelings of delight, which we accept will come and go. But doesn't the Buddhist understanding lead to a sense of less sort of emotional fluctuations of highs and lows? The Buddha talked about sort of equanimity, kind of a neutrality almost in getting rid of those highs and lows. Is that an accurate picture of the Buddhist formation of this?
There is a sense of, I guess we say, a middle way approach, not living life at the two extremes, but within that, delight's fantastic, joy, all of these. It's not having emotion. A sense of equanimity is about having a state of balance, emotional balance, cognitive balance, attentional balance, and also in our altruism and so forth. So we live a rounded life. And within that, there's nothing wrong with, taking great joy. In fact, it's a great thing to take great joy, rather that than being depressed and upset and being self-critical, which is what a lot of us do a lot of the time. So there's sort of like, it's a double-edged thing there of really, it's much more complex than just, it's not a neutrality. It's actually a more engaged life.
There's a question on the screen that I think relates somewhat to this. I'm going to ask you this, Mark. What of our failings? Sin, question mark, karma, and the relationship to happiness of those things.
Yeah, well, I think that we can't in ourselves attain happiness because of that. Because if it's up to us, we're going to mess it up. Because we know that, we can't even get in here without people letting us in because we got in the wrong lane. I mean, we're humans, and so we need something other than, I think, just our own pursuits and efforts and ambition and intellect to achieve happiness in life. And I think sin is a classic example that, we mess things up. And I also think that if it's just the external in terms of the situational, as we discussed earlier, all those situations change. We're in the fastest changing times ever, the trends, the shift. We're on constantly moving terrain. So I think relying on externals to give us happiness is also going to be very temporal. And that's where, I guess, City Bible Forum, there's got to be some external relationship that's not dependent on me and that's not dependent on my circumstances that can give something a bit more lasting.
Chokyi, it seems to me that this question of happiness relates very closely to the question of suffering. What, in the Buddhist framework, is the response when it comes to, say, deep suffering? You've lost a child, say. Where do we go with that loss in terms of ever retaining or regaining some form of happiness?
Yeah, I think it comes down to what our definition of happiness is, because it's not about being sort of in a high mood all the time. So obviously with sense of deep loss, I mean, it would be weird if you didn't grieve. It would be totally non-human. We would grieve, and it's natural to do that and go through all the processes associated with it. It's the stuff of life. So I think, again, it's sort of seeing this as a journey through life, and that within that there is a deep sense of connectedness. I think one of the things that, in grief, it connects us to others because others know what we're going through, or, at least similar enough experiences. that can help us deal with those situations. But I don't think happiness is about. It's not just about feel good all the time. It's really being able to sit with yourself and through the tough times and through the good times of not being, I guess, thrown off balance, not losing your centre, whether that centre is a faith-based centre. And I think this sort of deep spiritual connection is the thing that unifies us and brings us together, beyond all the externals, the extraneous things that happen in life.
Mark, before I come to Ross for a final word on happiness, because we're running out of time, unfortunately, but can you also relate it from a Christian framework, that understanding of the place of suffering within that, and perhaps hope as a somewhat of a response?
Yeah, absolutely. I think any meaningful answer to happiness, and clearly it's a great thing to have joy and happiness and fulfillment, it's what we want, has to deal with these realities. The downs are not just the ups. And I think that, again, it's the human experience, it's what we're going to have, and yet if it's just left to ourselves, we can't sort of think our way out of it or pretend it doesn't exist. It's the reality. We asked Australians in a survey, statements, which of these statements did Jesus say, which statements didn't he say, and just to sort of get a perception of people's understanding of Jesus' words. And a lot of people have got the results here. 1 in 5 said that Jesus said, God helps those who help themselves. That famous quote. So Jesus actually said the opposite of that. You can't help yourself. But I think that's the problem, that we think that we can do it, we can achieve, we can get ourselves out of this mess, and we can't, because we have suffering, and that's the reality. And I think we need an answer that goes beyond that.
Yesterday, Mark explained that a lot of people thought Jesus' last words were "such is life." That was a bit telling in terms of our biblical literacy. But Ross, can we come to you for a final word on happiness and our likelihood of achieving it, or the way we can work towards it?
Well, I'd like to go back to something we said at the beginning, because I think it's key, and that is, you can't just go straight to happiness. You can't spend your life saying, what do I have to do today to make me happy? That doesn't work. That's about being self-obsessed. That's about being hedonistic, trying to maximise pleasure and minimise pain. Happiness can only be achieved indirectly and almost unconsciously. And I have no trouble believing all the people who say, perhaps even all the religions that say, the way to be happy is actually to worry about the happiness of other people. And when you do that, and you keep yourself busy looking after your kids or your family or the neighbours, or doing whatever that involves in your life, you're not sort of gazing at your navel saying, am I happy, am I happy? One day, when you sort of pause for breath, you think, this is not a bad life I'm leading here. I'm helping people. I find that pretty satisfying. I am happy. Happiness is something that comes from, that you discover, not something that you pursue in a quite self-centred way.
Thank you, Ross. It seems like this is a really important discussion. People are very interested in it. The satisfying life seems to be something we ought to be taking seriously and thinking carefully about what's likely to lead us to it. We really appreciate your time and thoughts